Hello. Well, thank you for coming. Can you hear me? Okay? Yeah? In the back? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay, good. So this talk, I want to talk about the time I was at Lucasfilm, LucasArts, which was from 1982 to 1990. And I'll go a little earlier and just kind of run through a bunch of games that I worked on, and then hopefully leave enough time for questions at the end. So where did it start? So first, let's talk about me. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I was a huge science fiction fan. I would read lots of books, and loved watching Star Trek. I think I was exactly the right age to watch Star Trek and Twilight Zone, Outer Limits. So these were shows that inspired me in terms of warped thinking or creativity in science fiction. So I started off. Oh, I lost the picture. Okay, well, you saw it for a second. I started off as an engineering student at UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, and I was taking courses like calculus, physics, chemistry, programming in Fortran, and pretty much hated it. It was just not a good match for me. I thought that I could do okay, but it just never clicked. So I ended up transferring to humanistic psychology at Sonoma State. Transferred the way I look also. And there we had classes like psychology of dreaming, parapsychology, hypnosis, improv 101, and mime. And probably a much better match for eventually being a game designer than physics and everything. So I was never really a hardcore programmer. I was much more, I think, of a storyteller. Once at this new school, this was up in Northern California, we went on a field trip to Stanford Research Institute, and I saw my very first computer game. This would be around 1971 or 2. And it was Space Wars, and it was on a CRT. And just basically there are two little triangles that you can control and shoot at each other. But there's something that clicked. It's like, wow, this is it. So all the Fortran programming I was doing at UCLA using punch cards and paper tape, that was not going to be very fun, but this is something I could probably get into. And when I saw it, just fireworks went off. So meanwhile, in Marin County, so it turns out that I was living in Marin County, which is the same place that this company called Lucasfilm was located. Coincidentally. It was not my plan, but that's how it ended up. So they're working on this film called Star Wars, 1977. And around the same time, I had decided that I wanted to do something with computers, but not at the same level that, like the high-end mini-computer things. Microcomputers had just come out. 1977, Apple II was out, processor technology saw 20. So my wife and I opened a computer center. It was a public access, nonprofit. Kids could come in and rent time on our computers for like $1.50 an hour. There I am with my wife, and we had this space was in a school that had been closed down for lack of students. It's a relatively new school, so we had the library space, and it was perfect for multimedia. So these people would come in. We had birthday parties. We'd have field trips from schools. We taught really basic programming, early programming, using the basic language, and wrote a lot of articles in magazines. And one of my first programs, interestingly, was a Star Wars-inspired Hodge game where you have to find words hidden in an array of letters. So my first game there was actually a Star Wars game, not authorized. So these are the most of the computers we had initially. They're 8080 based. Company went out of business a few years later, but we liked them because they looked approachable. They had nice wooden sides, walnut sides, full keyboards. We looked at Apple II, but at the time they didn't have upper and lower case on their keys. It was all uppercase, and we thought that a lot of people would be doing word processing. So we went with this computer instead. Apple II might have been a better choice considering that it had games and color screens and sound, but this is what we did. You can see me up in the corner. This is my wife Annie doing a field trip with a bunch of kids. The time that we first opened, she'd ask the question like, how many of you have ever seen or touched a computer? And you might get maybe 1 or 2 people out of the whole group would have said yes. And 5 years later, it was flipped. So we were there kind of to help people who didn't have computers, so they didn't have to buy them yet, where they could actually try them out and do stuff with them. We weren't selling computers ourselves. It was all really educational. So meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, there was another company called Atari, and they had, also in 1977, they had this 2600 VCS video computer system that came out. And a couple of years later, they had the Atari 400 and 800. We ended up getting a bunch of these at our center. I think Atari donated a bunch. And I was pretty enamored with the game Star Raiders. We would put this Atari 800 on our big screen that you saw there. We had a large projector screen, a good sound system. We charged like $1 or $2 more for that because that was the premier gaming system with Star Raiders. I don't know if I have sound. Do I have sound on this?
Chwila przerwy, ponieważ ktoś wbił się nam częstotliwość i od 15 minut dziwi się, kogo słychać w jego słuchawkach, więc to my po prostu się przepniemy.
Okay. So, yay. So playing that on a big speaker system with a big projection was a lot of fun and just kind of puts you in it. And I don't know about you guys, but when I played this, I was in Star Wars. That was, I felt like this was probably a ripoff of Star Wars, but I was in the movie when I played this game. A couple years later, I co-wrote a book called Computer Animation Primer, and this kind of got me connected to Lucasfilm. I did a bunch of games, a bunch of demos that showed how you could do things using Atari's hardware for tricks for animation, making it do things a lot faster than it should be able to if you were just, say, using BASIC. That was using color registers to, basically you're not redrawing the screen, you're just changing colors and making it look like it's moving fast for you. I also went to the newly created Lucasfilm Computer Division, and okay, we get sound for this.
Instead of a dead moon, a living, breathing planet capable of sustaining whatever life forms we see fit to deposit on it.
Fascinating.
The reformed moon simulated here represents the merest fraction of the Genesis potential, should the Federation wish to fund these experiments to their logical conclusion.
So that was a piece from Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, and the newly created computer division at Lucasfilm, did this, and they used fractal landscapes, and I wanted to include that in my book. So I had, pictures from that in the book, showing what, here's the high-end computer animation, here's the low end with the Atari doing computer animation. So I got to meet a bunch of the people there, spent time hanging out. They actually, one of the guys, one of the co-founders of the computer division, Alvin Ray Smith, read my book, my manuscript, and made corrections, made sure it was accurate. And then in 1982, with Return of the Jedi about a year away, George decided to try doing entertainment outside of films. And he would create a new group that would be a part of the computer division, specifically to do games. And Atari was going to give Lucasfilm $1 million to help start this group in exchange for first right of any games that we do for the Atari. Peter Langston was the person hired to lead this group. He was basically a research scientist. And so we had this new joint venture for the Atari and Lucasfilm. And I was fortunate that one of our members at the computer center came in and said, hey, did you hear that Lucasfilm's doing this new games group? And I hadn't heard that, but I quickly called my contacts there, got one of the first interviews with Peter when he first came on, and I ended up being the third person hired for Lucasfilm Games, or the games group as it was called then. This is the, I know it's why it's doing that. It's like the images are being dropped out. Okay, well anyway, there was the people in the group. Let me go do from this picture. Upper left is Charlie Kellner. Below him is Dave Levine. Peter Langston standing. I'm sitting in the chair. Lauren Carpenter was the whiz who did Fractalus for the computer division. And he was on loan with us for about 6 months for the first game I worked on. And that's Gary Winnick, who was the first animator. Okay, there's the pictures. So the plan was to build a couple of throwaway games. I mean, it was very intimidating to come into Lucasfilm, which was known for Star Wars, and have expectations that right off the bat we were going to do the game's equivalent of a Star Wars movie with that much flash and technically at that level. So we said, hey, don't worry about it. We'll just do a couple of throwaway games. We'll do them. It was a research project. If it doesn't work out, we'll toss them and start over. So that took a lot of the pressure off of us, make it easier for us just to jump in and do the first games. If they're good, we publish them. Otherwise, so Dave Levine did Ball Blazer, and my game was essentially Star Raiders on a planet. I wanted that first-person point of view rush of flying through an environment. So it was kind of Star Wars-like, but not Star Wars. I mean, in fact, it turned out, what I didn't realize until after I started working there, that we were not allowed to do Star Wars games because the license for all Star Wars-related things had already been sold to other companies. So Atari had the coin-op rights, and Parker Brothers had the home rights. So we weren't allowed to do them. So I asked Lauren, who happened to be my office mate, whether it would be possible to do Fractals on an 8-bit microcomputer. And he kind of laughed at first and said, no way, no way to do it. Then he started thinking about it, and he said, well, there might be a way to do it. So we gave him an Atari to take home, and in about 2 days, he taught himself 6502 assembly, all the innards of the Atari computer, and came back with a working demo of flying through a landscape. No flight dynamics, but you could actually see it. So I wanted the game to feel like you were flying an X-wing fighter. And
use the Force, Luke.
So I got photos from the library, from the archive group, of what the displays look like. Actually got to see an X-Wing in a bay that they had left over from that movie. So I got pictures of it, got really close, get all the details, and then I did my attempt of duplicating this for the Atari. And there we go. That was pretty close. And so that was my original drawing, and this is how the display ended up. We ended up using player missile graphics for the struts, for the beam, the posts. Very jaggy. So one of the working titles for the game was behind, and the name of the aliens were called the Jaggies, the enemy. The Jaggies were also kind of the enemy of the computer division. They were trying to do technology to do anti-aliasing to smooth out the lines, but we didn't have enough colors to do that. So we just, okay, we have jagged lines. The name of the Jaggies the monsters were Jaggies, so we had a working title called Behind Jaggy Lines, and it's also a pun because the lines behind the screen are jagged. Here's a snippet. And this was the disk version. We had to convert it to disk, so we did a loading sequence while we were loading the game into memory. And this is supposed to be the mothership. And we were looking for that same roaring kind of good bass feeling that we got from Star Raiders for the sound for this. So I was the project leader on this. Lauren did the fractal environment. A guy named Charlie Kellner, you saw a picture of him, did the flight dynamics, and most of the animation kind of built on top of Lauren's code. I did a lot of the gameplay related stuff, so the tuning of it and the launch sequences. Pilot was knocking on the door. If you don't open the door for him, he'll knock slower and slower, eventually die because the noxious atmosphere will penetrate his suit and he'll just collapse. So my original design idea was that there wasn't going to be any shooting in this game, that you were just out there picking up pilots. So I assumed, okay, you had to get rid of the guns because you need more space. To destroy the enemy, you get them to follow you. You do these tight maneuvers in the canyons. They'd crash into the walls because they weren't as good pilots as you were, and that's how you kill the pilots, the enemy, but you didn't shoot them. So it's a pretty dumb idea. So we show the games to George, maybe during beta, and the first question he asks is, where's the fire button? And he's pushing the red button, nothing's happening. And he asked me if it was because it was a game, it was, to help the gameplay, or was it my personal philosophy to do that? And I told him it was more philosophy. He said, add a fire button, so I did. He also had the idea of this aliens pretending to be pilots. So that was, he felt that there needed to be some sort of tension to add, so we had to figure out a way to do that. The idea that every once in a while it'd be an alien running to you and not a pilot. So if you opened your airlock, if you got late, this wouldn't happen until later levels. So people would have played the game for maybe a few hours, gotten used to opening the anticipating the pilot, open the airlock. The alien would walk into the airlock and start tearing apart the ship. And you wouldn't see this, but there's a lot of audio. And I mean, I did have people swear that they saw the alien's arm coming around in front of you to kill you, but that was never in the game. It was just in their head. And so we ended up doing it so that the idea is that if you have an empty ship out there, the aliens will occupy that ship and pretend to be a pilot, or they'll kill the pilot, and then you have to quickly turn on your shields and fry them. And the amount of time would get shorter and shorter. Gary Winnick did the concept drawing of the Jaggy monster. And it was really important to us to keep it secret. We wanted it to be a jump scare, really. And for a lot of people, this is probably the first jump scare they ever had in a computer game, partly because we let them play the game for hours before this actually happened, and then, oh my God. So it doesn't show up in any of the press releases. There's no photographs about it. Atari was willing to play along with us on this. It was hinted at in the manual. There's a section at the end where a pilot is on the planet talking about being attacked by something, screaming, and we don't know what happened. So there's a little foreshadowing there. But that worked really well. So it was, I think who played the game and got scared by this? Anyone out there? Yeah, I see a couple people who played it. Yeah. So we brought in ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, that did all the special effects for Lucasfilm, to help with the box cover and the manual. And they'd already won a bunch of Academy Awards. They built models for us. They actually did a scale-size cockpit for the pilot to be in. They did a model of the Valkyrie ship that you're supposed to be flying. This is what it's supposed to look like. And they also did the box for the Ball Blazer, wrote the rotofoil, but they were really excited about the guy who did this, was super excited. I mean, he just got done spending a couple years on, let me go back a second. He spent a couple years doing Star Wars movies where all the ships were either X-Wings or TIE fighters, and actually have a saucer shape. He just went to town, put all this great detail in it. And in the manual, all you see it is like a little tiny saucer in the upper corner of the cover. And that's pretty much, so all the detail he did was pretty much lost. And there's also a shot of it inside the manual. I should go back a second. So I got to be on the cover. That's me running as a pilot, and that's also my legs in the cockpit, so I'm basically rescuing myself here. So I got to do both. And there's some of the boxes had a back cover image of me in the cockpit waiting to be rescued. So what happened to the computer division? Anyone know? Can you shout it out if you know? No? So George sold it to Steve Jobs in 1986 for $10 million, and it became Pixar. So most of the people who were doing high-end computer graphics left because they really wanted to do production, and there wasn't going to be space at the time inside Lucasfilm for them to actually do real production. So a few years later, there was this project with Jim Henson and George Lucas. Anyone know what this was? This game, there was a movie first. Yeah? Labyrinth? David Bowie, yep. So they got together to do this movie, and this was the first time. Well, I'll show you the trailer for the movie.
TriStar Pictures announces the collaboration of three extraordinary talents. Jim Henson, creator of The Muppets and Dark Crystal. George Lucas, creator of the Star Wars saga. And one of the most innovative forces in modern entertainment, David Bowie. Together, they will take you into a dazzling world of fantasy and adventure.
There's nothing to be afraid of.
A world where anything seems possible, and nothing is what it seems.
Everything I've done for you. I move the stars for no one. Run so long, run so far.
The world of Labyrinth.
So this was a pretty interesting opportunity. We weren't allowed to do Star Wars movies, but since Lucasfilm was the producer for this, they offered it to us to do a game based on it, and figuring, okay, this will get us some proof that we could actually do it, so maybe someday we'll get to do Star Wars movies. So we said, yeah. First time we could do anything with a Lucasfilm property. We got the script and some video showing where it was in production. Then in January of 1986, a group of us went to England to brainstorm on the design for the game, which is where the production was being done. And we ended up getting to work with Douglas Adams. So we spent a week brainstorming with Mr. Hitchhiker's Guide, and I was pretty intimidated, actually. I mean, I think I was mostly doing notes and throwing out a few ideas, but his mind was going so fast. I felt like I was trying to hold on to keep up. So it's my job to take all the design ideas and kind of keep the good ones and try to bring it into a cohesive story. It was going to be a graphic adventure with puzzles, but we wanted to make sure the people who hadn't seen the film were still on equal footing with those who had. So you wouldn't get a big advantage if you had seen solutions in the film. So we didn't really follow those solutions. And we wanted to keep the story tone the same. This came out on a Commodore 64, so we had stopped doing Atari stuff by now. And Douglas had the idea that you'd start it off as a text adventure without graphics to kind of give you the idea of, to give you that of how to use the interface. So instead of building a parser like Sierra was doing at the time, we didn't have time to do that. We knew that to actually do a really good parser would just take way more time than they had, because we had to get the game done before the movie comes out. So after you get through the text adventure, then you end up having the movie come to life. Jareth would talk to you and invite you into the movie, essentially, to play the game. So we did a bunch of things that we hadn't done before, scaling characters so they would get smaller as they walked away, scrolling backgrounds. I guess everyone kind of ice skated because their animation didn't keep up. We tried to use as many scenes as we could from the movie, so you felt like you were reliving it. The movie didn't do all that well. I think in some ways the game had more of an impact than the movie at the time, but because the movie wasn't a huge hit, Activision, who is the publisher, didn't put a lot of money into marketing. So it was okay. Some people really liked it a lot, but it wasn't a big success. So Skywalker Ranch, around 1985, we were packed up from where our offices were located, and we got to move the games group, by then it was called the Games Division, over to Skywalker Ranch. And this is I don't know, what is it? Huge plot of land that George owned, maybe a couple hundred acres, 5,000 acres. It's really large. Remember this number on the gate because it shows up later on. This is the main house at the ranch. This is the library. Watch for this spiral staircase, which you might recognize in a few places. We were located, our group was in what used to be called the stable house. The idea was this is where the horses would have been kept. They figured that would be good for game designers, so that's where we got to be. The whole thing was built from scratch, but there was a whole story behind each building and a history that went back like 150 years. So it was, this is George's vision of how, who the owners were and how the different areas were added on over time. So in 1986, Ron Gilbert, who had been playing Sierra Online's graphic adventures, kind of made a list of things that he thought we shouldn't do. One was, don't kill the player, at least no arbitrary death. If you're going to kill the player, it should be well broadcast ahead of time. If you're going to jump off of a cliff, you probably will die, but if you pick up a piece of broken glass, then you probably shouldn't bleed to death. In real life, you probably could survive that, so you should be able to survive it in a game. No arbitrary puzzles, no busy work. If you don't enjoy washing the dishes at home, you shouldn't have to wash the dishes as part of a puzzle in a game. No guess the parser. So he wrote an article on this, which is still online if you want to take a look at it, about why adventure games suck. So building on the experience we had with Labyrinth, Ron began work on an engine to do, specifically for graphic adventures. Labyrinth was all hand-coded in 6502, so it was really difficult to do and kind of constrained us a lot. But here he created a scripting language to make it much easier for the programmer to literally script the game, to make things happen. So this is Maniac Mansion. So some of the features that Scum had was that you could build while you're playing the game, you could build sentences by pointing on a verb and an object on the screen rather than having to type in something. Click where you want the character to go, and he'll go there rather than having to navigate like you're driving a car with cursor keys. We introduce cutscenes. We have non-interactive little movies to move the plot forward. And the scripts are multitasking. You could have multiple scripts running in the background. So you just launch a script when you enter a room and have it do something. And like I said, it's easy to understand. So here's an example of maybe the syntax that you might use in Scum back then. So walk actor would be the verb or the command for the programmer would do. Razor was the name of the character. To object microwave oven, and give that command, and she would navigate to that location, knowing where the position was she was supposed to stand for that object. Wait for her to arrive, and then have her do an animation like reaching out. Break here means just wait a frame, and then turn the oven on and have her say a line, this ought to be interesting. So you could read this and say, what's supposed to happen, which made it great. Another example, animated the clock. So we had a script which was essentially a loop which would change the state of the arm and the clock, wait a second, or 60 jiffies, change the state, and play a sound of a clock or a tick on after each time it changes. And the nice thing to do is when you first enter the room, you just have a command that says start script clock tick. And then it just forget about it. When you leave the room, it just automatically kills itself. So here's some of the concept art that Gary Winnick did. So there's about 9 to 12 months that Ron worked on creating Scum. And then at the same time that he and Gary were doing the design, then he asked me if I would be willing to come on as their first Scum programmer. And he figured it would take about 2 months, a month or two to do the whole game, and I could go on to do something else. And I think 6 months later, it still wasn't done yet, and I had to go on to something else, so I kind of let Ron finish it. But it did give us a lot. The game got really huge because you have different characters you choose in the beginning, and all the different combinations of characters you choose, each one has to be successful. You have to have a win, be able to succeed with them doing each one. So you end up with really creating, a dozen different games rather than just one. This is the box back. This is the original box. Unfortunately, we used the word lust, and one of the big stores in the United States wasn't willing to have a kid's game with the word lust on it, so we had to redo the box and get rid of that word. So here's the segment. So you choose 2 kids, and Dave is the opening. This turned out to be our first self-published title. So up to this point, we were going through third parties to publish, and now we became our own publisher. Can you guys read the text? Okay. So here's unlock door with key, so you could actually build sentences that were fairly complex. Here's the aforementioned spiral staircase that ended up in the library. So there are several things which we were inspired by the main house at the ranch to put here into the game here. And so this is an example of a cutscene. Moving the story along, cutscenes could be triggered based on timing or different events you might do inside the game. New Kid would let you switch between the different characters. Okay. Yeah. So we did a version for the for Nintendo, and they had much stricter rules about censorship. So we had to change a bunch of stuff. Had to get rid of this nude poster of a mummy. So it ended up like this. We had a statue of a naked woman, and we had to get rid of that in the game. So after Maniac Mansion, I wanted to do my own game, so we did Zak McKracken. Used the same engine. Wanted to do a new age game, and ended up working with a friend of our general manager, David Spangler, who was really a spiritual teacher. I went up to Seattle and brainstormed with him and put everything into the game we could think of. Here's a fan letter that we got soon after the game came out. Dear Sir, I'm returning this game, Zak McKracken, because I find it quite unsuitable. The excellent gameplayability and graphics further compound the real problem. The game is saturated with New Age Satanism teachings and concepts. The following are a few that I found I and others have come across. Eastern religions and meditation, African witchcraft and magic, a medium, a spiritual guru, and a religious devotee. A person converts to an Eastern religion. A superior guardian race of ancient ones, one religion over all of time and all of the world, communication by aliens through dreams, out-of-body experiences, mind linking with animals, changing of consciousness, mind over matter telepathy, mental telepathy, mind control by aliens. I not only find these false teachings objectionable, but consider the immersing of them in humor and presenting them as a game very dangerous. Not any of this was mentioned in advertisements for the game. I implore you to at least make it clear to unaware buyers that this is a new age game that deals with religion. As a computer consultant and part-time youth pastor, I have an obligation to others. In this regard, I will await your response before deciding how to further fulfill my responsibilities to warn others. You've been warned now. Reverend Merwin Updike. So this is a real letter we got. We published it, of course, in the fan magazine. It's a cover. I had the idea that if I didn't shave for the 9 months of production, I gained back a day or two. So both of us, that's me on the right, Matthew Kane, who is my co-designer on this, on the left. We included, for hints, we included the newsletter that, I'm going to actually skip this. This is me with my sweatshirt. This is what I looked like back then. So I want to skip over to Last Crusade because I'm told that I'm running out of time. So this is the second time we got to do a movie-based game. This time we also had a very short amount of time. So we put 3 designers on the game, myself, Noah Falstein, and Ron Gilbert. And so all 3 of us got together to do this. And as before, we had the script. We had some early production stills, so we saw what the sets would look like. The man with the hat is back, and this time he's bringing his dad. So this is the other team. There we are working in my office. I think we were trying to figure out a maze that we had in the game. I just wanted to point out those 2 paintings on the wall. When I first started working there, I was taken into a closet and said, hey, there's some production art from Star Wars, original Ralph McQuarrie paintings. Would you like any of these to hang in your office? So I think I picked 3 of them, but here's 2 that I actually was able to have. And it's very inspiring to be able to look at these and just, every day I walk in my office and see these. Anyway, so we had a meeting with Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and wanted to know if we could kill Indy, if that came up. And I said, sure. In fact, they actually let us deviate from the film if we wanted to. Steven Spielberg was suggesting all these subplots in South America, and we said, no, we're on a really tight schedule. We can't really add that much more stuff. But it was nice that we were able to do that. We knew Indy from seeing, this is the 3rd film, so we knew what he was like. We could write our own character designs. The sets and locations had been designed, and we had this great audience. But again, we want to make sure you could still enjoy the game even though you hadn't seen the movie, or if you had seen the movie, it wouldn't have ruined it for you. So really tight schedule. We had different ways to solve puzzles. So this is the opening from the movie. And we had to discuss, do we want to actually include this in the game? We didn't have time to include it, so that was a no. And there's another really important scene in the beginning where Indy gets a little wet. We couldn't include that either, so we had to pay respects to us. So here's our way of showing the circus train. In the opening credits became the circus train, but no interactivity. This is actually the 30th anniversary for this game. It was first released in 1989. We were trying to figure out how to do our credits so each had equal billing. So we kind of put the first one at the bottom and the last one on the top, so you really weren't sure who was more important. When Indy first walks up to Marcus, we have him dripping as a reference back to the opening scene in the movie. And Marcus says, "Hey, Indy, why are you all wet?" And Indy looks at the camera and says, "Don't ask." So I'm going to skip over here. So there's a scene, I was in Italy last year, and there's a great scene in the, we call it a library in the movie. So I got to go there and get my picture taken in front of it. It's not really a library. I mentioned this before about resolving conflicts. A bigger conflict was at the end where both Ron and Noah gave me dialogue for the end of the game. And I put Ron's in first, thinking it was placeholder dialogue because it's very irreverent. And then Noah said, no, mine was supposed to be the raw dialogue. So we had two sets. They both worked really hard on their dialogue. Wasn't really sure which one to use. So we had a very intense meeting to try to decide who to do it. And my idea was to randomize it. So each section, you could either get the serious version or the tongue-in-cheek version. So if you play through the end of it, you'll end up with one of the others. And here's, so you indeed have the heart of a true knight. That was probably the serious one. Of course, I'll be picking up this place for years. And that was more the tongue-in-cheek one. At the very end, we weren't sure how to do our credits, so we ended up randomizing this also, so depending on which way you play, might be one of us will be in the front. But other than that, we had a really good, it worked out really well. So that's that's the presentation. Do we have time for questions still? Okay, so rather than do questions now, we're going to do a panel and then open it for questions after that. Thank you.